Hi, this is Daniela Cambone, and it's really great to be continuing this yearly tradition now of catching up with the man considered the Renaissance man of really the mining industry because of his work in philanthropy, in art, in history, in culture, and of course, his long list of accolades in this industry. It's always an honor to catch up with you. Thomas Kaplan, chairman of NovaGold. Tom, like I said, it's really a yearly tradition, and I look forward to catching up with you. So nice to be with you back at the New York Stock Exchange.
Likewise, Daniela. It's always a pleasure to see you and indeed to catch up and see what the last year has given us.
Well, that's where I wanted to start. I wanted to pick up from where our conversation wrapped last year. And, it makes me just, reflect back and think, look how much changes in a year. During that interview that so many people adored, and frankly, were a little frightened, you warned us, and this was exactly 1 year ago today, you warned us that we were entering the most precarious and critical time since World War II. And of course, we spoke before the war in the Middle East. So I want to pick it up from there. So how do you see things unfolding, and what do you make of that soothsayer revelation from a year ago? Did you know what was coming down the pipeline?
Unfortunately, yes. And I don't say that in any self-aggrandizing form. I would much rather be wrong about certain of my forecasts. I would much rather that rather than being self-fulfilling, they are self-denying prophecies. But there are certain areas in which I have a relative advantage of being able to apply an understanding of history and of culture and of the domestic politics of most of the players in the region, and of course, geography. It's what General H.R. McMaster put in his book, Battlegrounds, the concept of strategic narcissism versus strategic empathy. And not to confuse empathy with sympathy. We're talking about particularly how to judge and rate and predict the moves of adversaries. And I do think that if you have an understanding that's grounded in geography, history, domestic politics, you can put yourself in the shoes of those that you're trying to analyze. And unfortunately, when I do so, and I look at what the Chinese called the correlation of forces in the world, there's no doubt that we are in a very perilous era. And last year, there was enough, to my mind, to have a foreshadowing of where we would be today. And the truth is that today, we are talking about Iran. And in the last 24 hours, Iran has attacked Iraq, Syria, and Pakistan. Missiles have landed in Baluchistan. You have, obviously, the war between Hamas and Israel. You have the Houthis in Yemen, who are essentially creating a blockage on the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, through which somewhere between 12 and 15% of the world's trade travels, and is now forced to take alternate routes around Africa. Just when you thought that the issue of supply chains was behind us, you all of a sudden have further signs that the greater geopolitical upheavals are having an impact on the global economy. And this has got to be something that people understand. I'm putting aside its impact on precious metals, just simply because this issue is far too big. It's far too impactful on our children to try to distill it in terms of, investment or financial implications. So I'd rather discuss it more geopolitically, and people can draw their own conclusions about what they want to own to protect themselves in this environment. But I'd rather just put out there the data points and try to connect them.
And I appreciate that. And I think it's crucial to do that. And I think because of your extensive background, I'm curious how you think this will play out. Because for most folks, I would say in North America, who are not following the news day to day, they just see it happening in that part of the world. It's not our concern yet, right? But like you said, it's escalating. The U.S. has just placed the Houthis, or are thinking of placing it on a terrorist watch list. How does this play out for you? Could it become a world war at this point?
Yes. And I hate to say it. Trotsky put it very well. And that goes to the heart of our wanting to distance ourselves psychically and even intellectually from the implications of what we're seeing. It's a form of cognitive dissonance where we see something, but we're not really embracing it in terms of engaging with it. Trotsky said, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And we all have to understand that we are in, to use a Kissingerian term, the foothills of a Cold War. And he was referencing the relationship between the United States and China. But it's now gone beyond that. You have an alignment between China, Russia, Iran, with some other disenchanted powers, such as Turkey, and obviously rogue states like North Korea, who have found common cause in trying to create an axis, a more souped-up version of what Iran calls the axis of resistance. In Iran's case, it's itself and its surrogates, its proxies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, and to some extent in the West Bank, Hashd al-Shabi, Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, and of course the Houthis. This is what they call the axis of resistance. The axis of resistance is geared towards the encirclement of Israel and the Arab Gulf states. And they've been unbelievably successful at being able to get away with it. The world has allowed them to create a sense of plausible deniability by using the proxies. But Iran is as responsible for what's going on as if it held the gun. The day that the world, or just segments of it, finally say, basta, no more. We don't accept this convenient fiction. You are the mothership, and you've taken the war to us. We're now taking it back to you. When that happens, we can see a very, very quick chain of events which create vacuums through which the West and also the Eastern axis may find itself on opposing sides. So you already have an unprecedented act of aggression taking place in the heart of Europe between Russia and Ukraine, which is supported by China, only to the point that they can help keep the Russians going, but they've thus far not passed any red lines with regard to the kind of things that they're supplying to the Russians. But they're certainly providing them with a financial backstop. You have the Iranians who've stepped in as a major arms supplier of suicide drones and soon ballistic missiles to Russia, which has skewed the relationship that previously existed between Russia and Israel, which was, status quo, and with some operational overlap in Syria. The Russians now see that differently, and the Israelis are starting to see that differently. But at the moment, the focus of the world is on what's going on since October 7th. And the truth is that this kind of event is one that I did warn against privately to the Israelis and to the Gulf Arabs, and then publicly in two interviews to Haaretz, publication in Israel, in which I warned that by not restoring a sense of deterrence, that Iran did not understand what the limits were, we were allowing them to engage in reckless behavior. As Lenin said, thrust with a bayonet. If you encounter mush, proceed. If you encounter steel, withdraw. From 2006, when the Israelis allowed Hezbollah to get away with sending missiles into Israeli cities, you've had that steady progression, that steady escalation. And you saw it in 2007 in Gaza, 2008 in Lebanon. You saw it with the Iranians fomenting the Houthi advance on the Yemeni capital, Sana'a, which then in turn caused the coalition led by Saudi Arabia and the UAE to intervene in Yemen. We're now seeing the chickens come home to roost, where Israel is now fighting Hezbollah in Lebanon, the consequence of which is that tens of thousands of Israelis, well over 100,000 if you include those who've had to move from the south, have now been displaced within Israel by radical Islamist powers, Shia power in Lebanon, the Hezbollah, and Sunni extremists, Hamas and the Islamic Jihad in Gaza. And now you have the Houthis. And with the Iranians very openly saying that they're going to use all of their proxies, including attacking American interests and Western interests, not just Israeli, to get their way. So we are in this moment of real inflection where you have the implementation of the Iranian policy, which is what the Germans used to call Einkreisungspolitik. Einkreisung meaning encirclement, because they were always afraid of a two-front war between France and Russia and Germany sandwiched in between. The Iranians have executed this. They have created the encirclement of Israel and coincidentally, or not coincidentally actually, the encirclement of the Gulf states. So if you were to look at Saudi Arabia, for example, say, here's Saudi Arabia, in the northwest, you have Jordan. And I believe that Jordan is the next big agenda item for Hamas and for the Iranians, because it has a majority Palestinian population. It's a real country with recognized borders. And I have been very strenuous in pointing out the risks to Jordan. It's not enough to just see what's going on there. It's imperative that we see it through Iranian eyes, that that's the missing link. Lebanon, right. Syria, Jordan, and you have Iraq, and you have that land bridge connecting Tehran with the Mediterranean, and you have the Houthis on the Red Sea. So you have this exquisitely implemented strategy, which is in its design and execution as beautiful as any Persian carpet, in which they've now achieved ancient agendas of getting to the Med and the Red simultaneously. But if you're the Saudis, you have that potential Sunni extremists, you have Shia extremists in Iraq on the northern border. If you add Jordan, then you now have that on the Red Sea. This is a problem for the Saudis. Obviously, for the Israelis, who get so much of their trade through the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, it's existential. When you have an encirclement, you create a race against time. And encirclement is all about being able to encircle your enemy, use proxies to create vacuums that then need to be filled, and ultimately to encroach on the enemy's space and to destroy its morale. At a certain point, the encircled power has to make a decision. Do they attempt to break out? Or do they, in essence, stand down and ultimately surrender their freedom of movement, their autonomy, and maybe even their independence? That point in encirclement is the most pregnant that you will find in international relations. And we are there.
About to give birth.
Yes, and now it could be this afternoon. It could be a year from now. But the Iranians have played their hand by engaging in suborning and abetting and financing and helping train people to carry out the most barbarous attack in decades. Certainly the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust. Worse than anything that we saw coming out of the Islamic State. And I spoke to a previous president of Iraq who said what Hamas did was worse than Daesh, worse than ISIS. Mm-hmm. So you have this, and you have this loss of empathy and the prospect of what is a just war. That's the bad news. There is good news, but right now, you know, we're in a season of darkness rather than a season of light. But there is, well, the good news is that the most revolutionary, in the positive sense, area of the world is in fact emerging out of the Arab Gulf. Mm-hmm. The reforms that have been undertaken by the UAE, by Saudi Arabia, are the best sign that if there is going to be an Arab Renaissance, a reawakening, a reopening of the Arab world's mind, we're watching it being played out. And the impact of that is that they are horrified by the extremism that they see, both Sunni and by Shia. And they want relations with Israel. Obviously, the UAE and Bahrain and several other Arab countries established that with the Abraham Accords. Arguably, some of the best signs of philo-Semitism in the world are coming out of the Arab world. And when you look at the reforms which have taken place on the religious side, on the economic side, social, cultural, you can look at the Arab world with a sense of encouragement that candidly you find in very, very few places in the world. Mm-hmm. And whether it comes to increased education, the empowering of women, and a re-embracing of cultural history, you're finding that in the Arab Gulf. And I've often applied that thesis to mining exploration. You know, if you're delusional enough to try to buck 1,000 or 10,000 to 1 odds, you've got to believe in miracles. And the truth is, miracles do happen. They can happen in the Middle East. There are a number of scenarios in which my worst case scenario could be deflected by, for example, Iran taking an off-ramp. Right now, you'd have to, you know, try to fade those odds considerably. But it doesn't mean that it can't happen. And I've seen stranger things happen in history. And there are grounds for hope. So it is, as Dickens put it, the best of times, the worst of times. That's where we are.
And it is an election year. We see the free Palestine movements happening all over the world. You know, hundreds of thousands coming out. Obviously, will be a critical focus point of the election. But I guess my first question to you is, what do you make of Biden's administration's? Like, what grade would you give Biden on foreign policy?
So that's an interesting question, because I would give him pretty high marks for the way that he has dealt with Ukraine and the Gaza war. There's no question that the support given by Western Europe, mostly economically, and by the United States, mostly militarily, has been crucial in being able to keep Ukraine independent. And the consequences of a disequilibrium, of the loss of Ukraine, would be devastating on the world economy. All of our assumptions about the price of liberty would be thrown out the window. And it would have very deep psychological as well as arithmetic implications. With the Gaza war, the leaning forward of Biden by sending 2 aircraft carriers to the Eastern Mediterranean and warning the Iranians publicly and their surrogates, if you're thinking of taking advantage of this crisis, I have 2 words, depending on how you view a contraction: don't. And that had a huge impact. The Iranians did not expect Biden to lean in that way. So I give him high marks for being very stalwart. Mm-hmm. He did 2 things that Ronald Reagan would have done. Now, some will criticize him. I criticize him for what we did in Afghanistan. I don't think we needed to leave, but he was dealt a hand that was left to him by the previous administration. I think it was politically impossible to be able to survive if Americans were killed in Afghanistan when Trump would be able to say, I was planning on bringing everyone back. These people are dead because of the Biden administration. I don't think Biden could have survived that. And his instinct was always to withdraw from Afghanistan. I don't think we should have. I think that we could have maintained a very light footprint there because the Afghans were fighting hard for themselves. It's a myth that the Afghans didn't fight hard, and the statistics belie that completely. In the previous 18 months, no Americans had died. And from the time that the Western countries, the NATO coalition, handed the military aspect of the war primarily to the Afghans, the Afghan casualties, which up until 2014-15 had been 13,000, 14,000, by the end of the war were at 49,000. So you can't say they didn't fight.
There is pushback from the American population on funding Ukraine. They're tired of seeing money keep flowing. There's also pushback on seeing the U.S. dollar weaponized, as many would say. What's your take? I mean, do you agree that the U.S. dollar is being weaponized? I mean, now there's talk of, okay, they're tired of us sending funds, so maybe we'll seize Russian assets, and that's how we will fund Ukraine. I mean, is it right for America to be involved? And do you agree that the U.S. dollar, do you think it's being weaponized?
It would have been a geopolitical earthquake and disaster for the United States not to involve itself in Ukraine. The Ukrainians are doing the fighting. They're dying. They ask for aid, military aid and economic aid. It is the best investment that the United States can make to give them what they need to fight the Russians. I'm not saying this because I am a Russophobe. This is Vladimir Putin's war. It clearly was a tactical as well as strategic miscalculation. When the war began, I was in Europe, and the general feeling was that he would make it to Kyiv in 72 hours. The fact that the Ukrainians held them off, if you're a religious person, you'd say it's biblical. Gog versus Magog, or something like this. And the fact that it was, a skinny Jewish comedian who was or is the president of a country, the region of which was considered to be one of the most anti-Semitic in the world a century ago, would be astonishing. It would be one of Ben-Gurion's miracles. You just wouldn't believe it. But it's happened. And the damage that has been done to the Russian military, the degrading of Russian forces, and candidly the unmasking of their corruption and ineptitude, has been one of the few dividends that the United States has had in years. And to pay tens of billions of dollars to have someone else fighting who shares our interests and most of our values against a country which doesn't, and not asking for American troops, but only saying, give us what we need to fight. This should be the essence of America's foreign policy, in the sense that it should provide us with a bipartisan logic that Republicans and Democrats should be able to rally around, which is to say, if we have an ally like the Ukrainians, like the Kurds, like the Israelis, who are willing to fight for our interests and, to a greater extent than not, our values, and they don't want American boys and girls out there, but just give them the tools to do the fighting that is in our mutual interests, that's a doctrine. That's something that even in a country as divided as America, Republicans and Democrats should be able to rally around. At least in that area, politics should end at the water's edge.
But I think for most people, they'll say, okay, great, we want to help people, but look at the country itself. I mean, we're in New York City, the homelessness, the migrant issue. I mean, that's what people are seeing, is that, and I know that the two should not be blended, help for Ukraine versus, what's happening back at home, but that's what people see. And from the politicians, they want them to first fix America.
Yeah, but you know something, that's demagoguery. The reality is that what we're giving to Ukraine is barely a rounding error. We're a country that is tens of trillions of dollars in debt. Mm-hmm. America hasn't shown fiscal discipline. We haven't had a balanced budget at the federal level since the Clinton administration. The Republicans and the Democrats are united on only one thing, and that is their willingness to spend money that they haven't been able to balance on the other side of the ledger. This is the great reality of American politics, which is that both parties are complicit in being willing to spend money that we don't have. When people are talking about budget cuts, so we have to think of America first, it's complete demagoguery. The investment in Ukraine is the best return on investment we've had in foreign policy in decades. We probably invested $1 trillion in Iraq and in Afghanistan, right. Maybe much more than that, for which we have no return on investment. With the Ukrainians, they have fought and won. When given the tools, they have shown that they are the implementation of really the Reagan doctrine at its purest and at its most ecumenically favorable to the United States. And so don't say that 10, 20, 30, 40, $50 billion, it doesn't mean anything anymore. And anyone who says that it does knows that they're lying to the American people. I grew up as a Reagan Republican. And this is something that I have no doubt Ronald Reagan would have embraced. There isn't a chance in the world that he would have denied Ukraine money. And candidly, the fact that it's Republicans who are pushing back in Congress and making these demagogic representations, we have to focus on our country first, and yet continuing to call for tax cuts that the rich do not need. Trust me, it's nonsense. It's actually insulting.
let's get to the second part of that question. And I know I'm getting to gold. I'm getting to gold, people. But the weaponization, or do you think it's being weaponized, and do you think that the US dollar is in a fragile state?
There's no question it's being weaponized. The only issue is, from a cost-benefit analysis, is that the right thing for the United States to do? And the reality is that it is one of the great legs of economic power that we have in the world, that the dollar is so preponderant in terms of the world's currencies. I mean, it should probably be 15% of reserves, 20% maybe, not 60.
Right.
This is a distortion. There are reasons for the distortion, because whereas I do believe that over time the dollar will erode in terms of that preponderance, and become more reflective of the real situation of trade, there are conditions which are very favorable to the dollar. Until the Chinese have a totally freely converting currency, the dollar provides liquidity. But over time, there's no doubt that the Chinese, with their partners, will try to undermine the dollar.
The BRIC, are you talking to BRICS with
Sure.
their partners? So
Absolutely.
Let's talk that. Let's go there.
Whether they succeed or
Let's
not
go
is
there.
the question. Ultimately, I think that inertia will take it forward in that process. But there are things that could accelerate it.
I said at the start, how much a year can change. And last year we were talking about the BRICS, and I think Saudi Arabia had just changed. And here we are 1 year later, 5 new nations added. And, we used to just say, these are like a bunch of misfits at the table, No one really wants to sit with them yet. No one's really taking them seriously yet. Oh, they're just a bunch of talk. They're just talking, the BRICS. But they keep growing. They keep growing in power. And the common denominator there is the power they have in energy. Do you think the BRICS, is it right to discount the BRICS, or do you think that they are going to be a force to be reckoned with?
Ultimately, they're a force to be reckoned with. I'm not saying that they deserve or merit the power, but you are talking about the vast majority of mankind being subsumed in those populations. And the truth is that for everything that I said about America's interest with Ukraine, governments representing the vast majority of the world are either tilted towards Russia or ambivalent at best. That's besides the point. For Europe and the United States, Ukraine staying independent is existential. And one of the reasons is the interlinkage between currencies and energy and geopolitical power, military power. The damage to the prestige of the United States by a loss of a country such as Ukraine to the Russian autocracy, or the loss of Israel to the axis of resistance, would have a tremendously negative impact on America's economy in the long term. Because if we accept that the US dollar is a fundamental pillar of American economic hegemony, that's what makes it a lightning rod for the Chinese, the Russians, and South Africa, Brazil, et cetera. But if we accept that, then you have to ask yourself, what do we need to do in order to maintain it? And that's where the question of the weaponization comes in on a cost-benefit analysis. In the long term, the weaponization may harm the US dollar because people will rightly look for alternatives, a beneficiary of which is gold. But as John Maynard Keynes said, in the long term, we're dead. So we are dealing with existential political military crises right now. And there's no doubt that the weaponization of the dollar, particularly with regard to Russia, has had an impact. And I think it's one of those things where, like the way that we bailed out the world in 2008, 2009, what are the long-term implications of throwing the whole chessboard of fiscal and monetary restraint out the window? We don't know yet. But what we do know is that had that intervention not taken place, the plumbing of the global financial system would have been stuck and we would have gone into a depression. So people will argue, and historians go in cycles over these things, what was right, what was wrong. They'll argue about it, but the fact is that you have to ask yourself, what's the cost of taking an action that in the long term one isn't sure of the consequences, versus the near-term exigencies of actually dealing with a crisis in the here and now. So the dollar has been weaponized. It has had an effect. It has had a positive effect with regard to the Ukrainian story. It may have accelerated a desire by BRICS to seek an alternative. But there are ways for the United States to mitigate that. So, for example, Saudi Arabia, there have been lots of rumors that the Saudis will move away from the dollar as being the only way to value oil. On the other hand, there have been very serious discussions, which are public, of the United States providing a security guarantee to Saudi Arabia. For sure, one of the quids pro quo will be that the Saudis stick with the dollar.
Right.
Big deal.
Right.
So it's the United States has cards to play.
Right.
And by the way, that's certainly an instance where I think we should play that card, because it would be very powerful if the United States could keep Saudi Arabia within its orbit, and in fact, the whole Arab Gulf. This is what's called crisis management. It's what's called in financial world lingo, fast-moving market conditions. Sometimes you're not sure what to do, like what Hank Paulson did in 08, 09, but you know you have to do something because the alternative is collapse. And
will the U.S. always have those cards to play? I mean, people will say, well, all empires will eventually fail. At one point, do all the playing cards go away?
For sure. There is nothing sacred about the American political system. There was a great judge, probably the greatest jurist who didn't become a member of the Supreme Court, Learned Hand, who said, liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. If it dies there, no law, no court, no constitution can preserve it. If people lose faith in the openness and the, for want of a better word, liberal democracy, small l, it has nothing to do with Democrats or Republicans, liberal democracy, and as a place where the rule of law is sacred. If they lose faith in that in the United States, you could have a dollar crisis. And your viewers out there would be shocked at, you know, how quickly wealth can evaporate.
Yes.
Because as George Soros put it,
yes.
Of all the investment decisions which one has to make, the most important decision is the choice of which currency in which one will be denominated.
Right.
For me, that currency is gold. For others, it may be something else, but we have to understand that.
Let's talk gold, because last year at this time, I was telling you how investors were frustrated that gold could not hold above 2,000. Now that we're here, alas, and getting back to your point, of course, no one wants to see a gold rally because of geopolitical tensions, right? Now, I guess the new question, Tom, is 2,000 the new bottom?
Well, I think you always have to fade the numbers, because who knows how many stop losses can be triggered if gold goes below a certain point, below 2,000. But the beauty of the gold chart is that we have been in a bull market for more than 20 years. And phase one of that bull market was 12 years where gold went from 350, 400 to as high as 1,800, which I call phase one. Phase two was a consolidation between, let's say, 1,100 and 2,000-ish. And I believe that when we look back at the chart, we will see that, again, you have to fade spikes down as well as up. You will see that we are embarking upon a wave three that will take gold to a new equilibrium level between 3,000 and 5,000.
If you had to really break it down, when someone asks you, well, Tom, why do you sleep well at night? Not stressed with most of your wealth in gold. What's the answer? Why gold?
Gold gives me everything that I need to feel that I have protected my family, and because I'm in the business, to make a lot of money on the most leveraged aspects of that trade, which is the equities, when inevitably the tide turns and we see a rush into those equities that will be paralleling that rise in gold to the new equilibrium level. So gold gives me everything that I need. You don't have to be a gloom and doomsayer. As I said, gold's been in a bull market long before we had any of these geopolitical emergencies. And so if gold goes above the 2,100 area and starts to have that sustained liftoff that I believe we will see, don't believe it's because of the geopolitics. It's for what I would call non-fear factors. Why did I sell my energy company in 2007 to pivot into gold? There were two reasons. Number one, when I started the company in 2003, 2004, the price of oil had gone to $18, gone actually below $10 at one point, and my analysis was that oil would go to over 100. Gold at that time was $500, let's say. When I sold the company in 2007, oil was at 120 from 18, and gold was at 600, 650. And that seemed to me to make sense. And I would apply that to silver as well. Now, this is where why am I so comfortable, why do I sleep so well with gold aspect comes into play. Since the time that I sold my energy company, oil went from 120 to at one point minus 20. Gold went from 600 to over 2,000. There were people who said, what do I need gold for? I have oil. They're commodities. And my attitude was, no. Oil is a commodity. Gold is a currency. And then when you look at the other monetary items that we call currencies, when I sold my energy company, dollar-euro was 147. Gold has tripled while the dollar has strengthened. So gold doesn't need commodities to go up to multiply. Gold doesn't need a weak dollar to multiply. The geopolitical environment was fairly stable. We did not have inflation, which is the other thing that people say is a prerequisite for higher gold prices.
And stocks were rallying.
Completely. So if it looks like a duck, and it walks like a duck, and it quacks like a duck, and it even tastes like a duck, it's a duck. Now, at the same time, the reason why I pivoted to gold, and I said it at the time, was I wanted to deal with the upcoming financial crisis, which was apparent to me in 2007. And I used that to exit our energy company. I used that to exit our platinum company because these were economically sensitive. I wanted to move into a currency that could not be debased. And the best one that I could find was gold, which has made new all-time highs against all currencies, including
Correct.
the dollar. So nothing has changed in my worldview. If anything, I've had what psychologists would call positive reinforcement. But then again, so have the Indians. Every Indian who's ever bought gold since the dawn of mankind is doing well. So having gold as a store of value, having it as the best performing currency in the world, having it as an asset which does not represent someone else's liability, to me, it's the perfect asset. And who wouldn't want, to find that?
I've been working on Wall Street for 20 years now, and gold, at least in media, has always kind of been treated as this kryptonite, right? Like they only really talk about gold when it's rallying. We don't talk about gold on Wall Street. But on the flip side, look at the acceptance that Bitcoin has had on Wall Street. Why, Tom?
Bitcoin speaks to a certain age, but it's the same argument. I'm delighted to see that people have bought into the gold argument. I mean, one of the most powerful arguments made by proponents of cryptocurrencies is that it's gold 2.0. Mm-hmm. So I no longer have to tell people when I meet them, when we talk about gold, I no longer have to make the case of having the merits of gold being that it is a currency that can't be freely debased. They buy that. It used to be, until the cryptocurrencies changed the narrative or reinforced our narrative, it used to be that people would say, well, you can't use gold.
Right.
You can't eat it. And my response would be, what do? You eat yen, you eat euros, you eat Aussie. It's a currency. And now people understand that having a currency that cannot be freely debased is good news. And the best sign that we're all right in that respect has been the buying by central banks,
right,
which know better than anyone else the true value or lack therein of so much of the world's paper. The buying by China and India competing over who's the largest purchaser. We in the West suffer from a certain form of narcissism, but the pivot, the shift to different kinds of economic power to Asia, one of them is the buying of gold. And when gold pops, and we who are a little bit more feckless in the West start to say, oh, you know what? That makes sense. I'm jumping in there. It's only going to add kerosene to the fire. I mean, they'll start by going into the ETFs. And then I think that you will see gold stocks, particularly those which are in safe jurisdictions, which goes to a lot of what we just spent a considerable amount of time discussing. All of that reinforces my own narrative, which is that the way to sleep well at night is to have the greatest amount of leverage to an underlying theme in a jurisdiction that will allow you to keep the fruits of that leverage. And that's why NovaGold is, for me, the perfect asset.
And I want to talk NovaGold and the miners, but just one more question out of curiosity of when you do get that pushback of, well, then, Tom, why wouldn't you be in Bitcoin if it is gold 2.0 and it's just a better version of gold and it's the fastest horse in the race and Bitcoin is here to stay? Do you have a one-line answer you tell those folks?
There are a lot of things that can go wrong with cryptocurrencies, not the least of which is that there are a lot of things that can go wrong with the platforms on which they're held. If there's going to be, a collapse of the Bronze Age again, it's likely to come from some butterfly effect calamity that hits the internet and the global financial infrastructure. And I don't know how that affects cryptocurrencies. And when I don't know something, I prefer to avoid it.
How many hours of sleep does Tom Kaplan get? Aim to get?
I look for 8 hours.
8 hours? Wow.
Yeah.
You're able to. So you're up at what time to do everything you do in a day?
Probably about 7.
I want to talk NovaGold, but first, I mean, look, with gold $2,000 an ounce, this should be the time for miners.
And I think it will be. I think that what you will see is a stealth breakout, that people will not really be noticing that a bottom was put in. And then the way that the markets work, once people see that something is performing, they want to buy it. And people very rarely buy something that's truly depressed and represents value because they're afraid. They see it as buying a falling knife. Now, the great investors of the world, like Warren Buffett or Li Ka-shang and some others, they looked for falling knives. They did their analysis and they said, is that justified? Or are people just running in the opposite direction, in which case I'm going to load up the truck? And that in turn creates its own virtuous circle. I mean, it's just a truism that in the financial world, unlike the real physical world where people buy more of something when it's cheaper, in the financial world, people need the ratification of the auction process that are the financial markets in order to see that other people are buying too. And then when things start to outperform, they then want to get in on the action because people have a fear of missing out.
Of course, FOMO.
Exactly.
Right.
So most people would rather lose money in conjunction with other people and buy something that's overvalued because of FOMO, and then watch it go down because they're afraid to sell it lest it goes back up and it shows their neighbor to have been more prescient than they are. That's just human psychology, and it hasn't changed.
Where do you want to see NovaGold a year from now?
I want that the investing public will reach the conclusions about NovaGold, and by extension, the Donlin project, that we have reached. That Fidelity, John Paulson, the Agnellis, Tocqueville or Sprott, First Eagle, not to mention, of course, BlackRock, Vanguard, and the rest, but a lot of smart money has come to understand that the NovaGold story is an extraordinary one because it is a pure play on an asset that it's in its combination of virtues is unique. I can literally ask someone to say, tell me if I'm wrong. In terms of its size, in terms of its, first of all, you start with 39 million ounces in measured and indicated. You start with 2.25 grams of gold, open pittable. This is where the gold industry was 20 years ago. We're now approaching a gram, and new discoveries are lower than that. So when you have the quantity, you have the quality, you have the ability to mine it to scale, and then the grade kicks in to be able to give you very low operating costs, because if you're mining 2.25 grams versus 1 gram, or 1.25 grams, ceteris paribus, your price per ounce on an operating basis is going to be half. That is a relative advantage. Then you take into account that the 40-ish million ounces are on only 3 kilometers of an 8-kilometer mineralized belt that's already been identified. That 8 kilometers, in turn, only represents 5% of the land package that we have with Barrick. Then, of course, you superimpose onto that fabulous relationships with the native corporation partners and the fact that we are in one of the world's tier 1 jurisdictions. Alaska is the second largest gold producing state in what's considered to be overall the safest large jurisdiction in the world. And for me, jurisdictional risk now is the gating factor for whether or not you want to own anything.
How does that relationship with Barrick work? Do you speak to Mark Bristow regularly, or I'm just curious?
Mark and I go way back. I would say that, you know, when it comes to Barrick, you know, Mark and I have a very different view on jurisdiction. I made my bones in Bolivia, Zimbabwe, South Africa.
Right.
I sold Kibali to Mark when I was the largest shareholder of Moto Gold Mines, which I accumulated during the financial crisis. In fact, he will always say that the two people who really believed in Kibali were himself and me. So I come from that world of the, how should we put it, the go where the gold is mentality, or go where the silver is mentality. I decided to leave that behind. There came a time when I went from being, you know, very, very adventurous to seeing the world in a different way. You've heard some of those prognostications. And I decided that whereas I probably had the most expansive gold exploration portfolio in the world at one time, from Mauritania through to Pakistan, Malaysia, and pretty much everywhere in between. I was, according to the Arab sovereign wealth funds who invested with me, probably the largest holder of mineral rights in the Islamic world. Nice Jewish boy from New York, so, you know, hardly stereotypical. But at a certain point, I came to the conclusion that that world, which began with Newmont going to Yanacocha with Buenaventura in the 90s, that world was going to come to an end. And as I always say, there's that wonderful line of Woody Allen where he said, "I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there when it happens." And I thought, you know what? It's time to go. And I got rid of everything between Mauritania and Pakistan. And I said, I'm going to focus on the part of the world where I can sleep at night, where the rule of law is not a novelty, where you do not rely on a relationship with the hairdresser of the mistress of the deputy mines minister and all of that other nonsense. I want to come back to a place where I'm comfortable, where I know that when I go to sleep at night, what I thought I owned, I still owned in the morning. There aren't that many places left. So I came back to the future. But the interesting thing was when I came back, because we were still dealing with the fumes of the go where the gold is mantra, assets in the heart of darkness were trading at greater valuations and multiples than North American assets, because people still said, well, it's harder to get things permitted in North America, and you have more environmental restrictions and the like. And my attitude was, you know what? There's merit to that. But the point is that when you get your federal permits and state permits, like NovaGold has, you own it, and they're not going to take it away from you. Whereas I do believe that, especially if I'm right on the price of gold, most gold assets in the jurisdictions where the rule of law is not truly inculcated will be nationalized as strategic, like we're seeing with lithium, like what may very well happen with copper.
It basically is gold confiscation.
Correct. And it will come either piecemeal in a salami strategy or outright. I mean, if you look at West Africa, who's the big player in gold now? It's Russia. The Wagner Group. I mean, Russia is looking for gold from a belt that stretches from the Red Sea to the Atlantic. The Chinese are looking for gold. The Chinese are not just the world's largest producer of gold, they buy all of it. And the Indians, depending on the year, are the largest importers. These are strategic assets.
Could you see this nationalization happen in Canada and the United States?
No.
No.
The only scenario in which that happens is if the United States decided to go back to the gold standard. Mm-hmm. When Roosevelt confiscated gold, he had to in order to gain control of the money supply because the dollar was literally as good as gold because you could trade, your currency into gold. It's not the case anymore. You can't buy fiat.
So you don't think gold confiscation could happen again?
There's only one way it could happen, and that is if gold rose to a level that it would be able to cover a meaningful metric of the money supply. And for that to happen, the numbers that I used to look at, and that was, that was before the global financial crisis, you were talking about 20,000, 25,000 even then. If people start to have a sense that there is a snowball effect for things that might happen with the dollar, or scenarios in which we could have runaway inflation, or conversely, a depression, which is also very good for gold. One way or the other, you could have that psychological move where people go back in a very atavistic, ancient way, go back to something that has given them a sense of value, going back to before the Lydians created the world's first coinage out of Electrum, which is a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver.
Fascinating insights. And as we wrap here, Tom, making the brilliant case for gold, I asked you, you obviously get good night's sleeps, and with talk of World War III aside, is there anything else that keeps you up? I mean, we didn't even talk about the Fed pivot or the possibility of central bank digital currencies. Are there any other concerns?
Truth be told, if we discuss the Fed or digital currencies, my answers would probably be something along the lines of, I don't know. One of the lessons that I tried to give when young people will say, give us a lesson. Most of the time I just say, be lucky, There's that great line attributed to Napoleon, but probably actually preceding him with Cardinal Mazarin, that, don't give me smart generals, give me lucky ones. And in the exploration business, I think, any of my pals like Ross, Beatty and Bob Quatermain, and, the great explorationists, Bob Friedland, Lundin, you mentioned Frank Giustra, we all recognize the power of luck. And, Ross puts it beautifully. He says, she's the only thing that, has never let me down. Same thing for me. Yeah, la fortuna. And I'm a very, very big believer in that. But
being born lucky, can you become lucky?
Well, first of all, let's understand anyone who's born where your parents don't have distended bellies from hunger, or where they are not fleeing starvation or political oppression or anything else, you're already lucky. And you should already be counting your blessings. Then, there's genetics and who you're born to and whether you have good parents. And then so many sliding doors phenomenons. I know that I'm the product of many instances where if I'd gotten off the elevator 30 seconds later, something that came back and redounded and candidly made me wealthy would not have happened. And so you either take the tack that, I bucked 1,000 to 1 odds and found something, I'm a genius. And if it happens again, I'm a super genius. Or you look at that and you go, whoa, this shouldn't have happened. Luck or la fortuna has been with me, and I'll try to do something that merits her goodwill. And it leads you then into all kinds of other ways of living a good life. And a good life means being grateful. And it means giving back to the people and the causes that care to you. And that has certainly been the overweening ambition that I've had for decades now. But, on a more prosaic note, I can't really influence somebody to be lucky, but I can influence them by giving them one piece of advice, especially when they're young. If you have true conviction about something, pound the table.
Passion.
Passion. Go all in. But if you don't have that conviction, feel free to say, I really don't know. And if somebody presses you and says, no, you must have a view, say, no, I actually mustn't have a view. I want you to focus on that which I really believe is going to happen. And I know that even if you say that you won't hold it against me, that I gave a flippant, off-the-cuff remark about, something that you're asking, you still will, because it's human nature to remember the mistakes people made. So if you are going to make a mistake, do it in a grand way. If you're going to fail spectacularly. Don't fail because you felt the need to be glib. So 90% of the time, I'll say, I really don't know. But it's that time when I say, the Iranians are going to attack next month, this day and date. And then go all in on that, if you truly believe it. This is always my advice. Stay true to yourself and don't let people get away with forcing you to answer questions that you can't with maximum conviction. And I think it's probably fair to say, in my case, that I'm not subtle when I believe that I have a handle on how I see things happening.
So I guess my question to you is, obviously the question of legacy has to come up and what you want to leave behind. What do you want people to remember Thomas Kaplan for?
I have been blessed, and I say this as a way to distinguish between a gift and talent, which can be nurtured. But I've been blessed with having multiple passions that create their own ecosystems, some of which overlap. So I developed a love for art, particularly classical art of the Dutch Golden Age, from the time that I was 6 years old. Same for my love of history, began then and was nurtured. The same time as I developed this boyhood yearning that when I grew up, I would be a wildlife conservationist, focusing on saving tigers and the big cats. I developed a deep connection to antiquities. And as part of my study of history, ended up pursuing saving cultural heritage in war zones. As part of my love for the environment, ended up co-founding with my wife and Alan Rabinowitz Panthera, which is now the leader in cat conservation around the world. My study of history, I pursued all the way through my undergrad and doctoral work at Oxford, where I could have pursued that as an academic. But instead, I chose to use an affinity for the understanding of cycles to give me a relative advantage in natural resources, for which I have no natural, aptitude, intellectually or in terms of training. I'm not a mining person or an oil and gas man, but I've known how to pick the best to surround me and to tell me the truth. There's a wonderful Russian proverb that it's better to be slapped with the truth than kissed with a lie. And I've always surrounded myself with people whose job is to recognize that, as King Solomon put in the Proverbs, as iron sharpens iron, so a friend should sharpen a friend. Tell me what I need to know. Never tell me what you think I want to hear. For that, there's zero tolerance, because I immediately lose my confidence, because I know what I don't know. So whether it's been in art, in culture, the environment, in my business, the common denominator has been wanting to move the needle and to do it in a way that I can be proud of, to do it in a way that my children can say, Papa did it right. He didn't go out of his way to harm anyone in the making of his movie, and had a very, very firm conviction, which I always teach my children, and which they know I adhere to, which is don't lie. And I know that sounds really strange, but the ancient Persians were a nomadic people before they took over Mesopotamia and became peripatetic, but more, urban. And an ancient Persian prince was taught three things: how to ride a horse, they were the best horsemen; how to shoot a bow and arrow backwards, they didn't have saddles in those days; and how not to lie. It was a fundamental precept of Zoroastrianism, and had a huge impact on the Jewish religion as well. And so I always tell the kids, don't lie. And so in the household, when they absolutely want to hear the truth, they go, that's it, I'm going to Papa. And I'm very proud of that. I'm proud of the fact that they know that
no matter
I mean
how
what
brutal.
I say, no matter how brutal, but also they know that I've really led a life of trying to move the needle, to make a difference in the things that I've cared about. And I believe I have. And so it's hard not to lead a happy life if you've actually fulfilled something in all the areas that really moved you. And so to me, that's really the key to happiness, because when you learn to be grateful for what you've done, for what you've been able to do, for who you have in your life, what you have in your life, then you can understand that happiness doesn't come from wanting someone new or wanting something new and shiny. It comes from loving what you have, not what you think that you want. And if you really embrace that philosophy, and it's an ancient philosophy, this is, it sounds like a Hallmark card, but, it goes back to the ancient Greeks, also in different geographies, Buddhists, and, even further east in Asia. If you really believe it, you can be happy and you can endure trials. So, my legacy is not what people will say about me afterwards, because the truth is that maybe my kids, I hope, will remember it. After that, less likely. And I don't care. I care about what contribution I've made in my lifetime. And I'm not thinking about eternity. I'm thinking about, when I go to sleep at night, did I move the needle in one of the areas that matters to me?
Wow.
And if I did, that was a good day. Wow. And if I have an accumulation of good days, the best legacy that I can have is to show that I can live well. That's all that I need.
I love that. The great Tom Kaplan. I mean, who should play you in a movie?
Well, apparently, I do look like Danny Kaye, or at least I did. But that's a name that so few of your viewers would still remember. But that's dating me.
Well, I want to thank you for your time. I thoroughly enjoyed this. Merci, grazie, in whichever language. I'll take an hour with you anytime, Tom. Thank you so much.
Merci infiniment. Grazie mille. And my thanks to you for once again just a splendid and enjoyable time, and I wish you and all of your followers peace and
Yes.
thriving.
Yes. And on that note, peace above all. Thomas Kaplan, thank you so much. And thank you all for watching. We'll have more great content headed your way, so be sure to stay tuned to the Daniela Cambone Show. Thank you for watching.